Hi, welcome to the second lesson on variables. In the previous lesson, you learned about the different types of variables such as interval variables, categorical variables, and more. In this lesson, you will be learning about the way variables interact with one another and how they can influence your tests. Especially in HR and people analytics, when you start to think about conceptual models and things to analyze, you need to know how different variables relate to each other. I will give a quick run through of what a dependent and independent variable are, and the influence of moderators and mediators. It's an important lesson before Module 3, where we start with the actual statistical test. So, let's get started. So what is the independent and dependent variable? An independent variable is the variable that is changed or controlled in your analysis. The dependent variable is affected by the independent variable and is the variable you measure. In other words, the dependent variable can be seen as the thing you're trying to predict, whereas your independent variable can be seen as the thing you're trying to predict it with. Or, in yet other words, the independent variable is your input and your dependent variable is your output. So, if you think A causes B, you say A is the independent variable and B is the dependent variable. As an example, if we say in HR that someone's personality affects someone's performance, then we say personality is the independent variable and performance is the dependent variable. If we change the personality, for instance by taking a second person with a different personality, the dependent variable, that performance, will also change. We know from literature that personality actually predicts job performance. Literature shows that people who score high in extraversion perform on average slightly better compared to people low in extraversion. In addition, we see that people who score high in conscientiousness also on average perform better compared to people who score low in conscientiousness. Conscientiousness is one of the top predictors of future work performance. You see something similar in the relationship between IQ and job performance. IQ is the independent variable, and if IQ would change, then someone's work performance, the dependent variable, would also change. However, there are more variables that can influence the dependent variable than just the independent variable. Control variables are variables you may want to include in your analysis, as they exert a certain influence on the dependent variable. These control variables have been proven to influence the dependent variable. So, if you test the relationship between someone's personality and someone's performance, you may also want to include certain control variables, such as their education level, their IQ, their age, the type of job, their sex, etc. The change you see between personality and performance may well be explained by these control variables, if you don't account for them. Control variables correct the main effect that you're trying to discover between the independent and dependent variable for any change in the control variables. The control variable itself is not of primary interest to the experimenter. For instance, let's go back to our example about the relationship between personality and performance. As we know from literature, there are numerous factors that can influence performance. It's important to take certain variables into account, like time on job. When someone just joined the company half a year ago, his or her performance will not be optimal yet. This means that your performance ratings may be biased if you're not controlling for time on job. Another often included control variable is sex. Sex often has a certain influence on your dependent variable, sometimes in ways you may not realize. For instance, if you look at performance ratings in your organization, you may see that men receive better performance ratings than women. However, this might be because people in senior positions often have better perceived performance compared to people in lower ranks of the organization. Sex has an influence on this, as men are overrepresented at the top of the organization, while women are slightly overrepresented at the bottom of the organization. Thus men, as they are overrepresented at the top of the organization, and the top is often perceived to have better performance, have a bias in their ratings. Therefore, when performance is included in an analysis, sex should be used as a control variable, as this variable may skew the results in a certain way. In both these cases, the control variables are not what we're interested in, as literature has already established that they can influence the dependent variable. You are interested in the independence variable influence on the dependent variable, whilst controlling for these other variables. Now, another thing that you want to consider in your statistical test are what we statisticians call moderator variables. Moderator variables influence the relationship between the independent and the dependent variable. A good example of moderation can be seen in this picture, where they show the effect of training level on job performance for two groups of people. People who have a high degree of autonomy in how they conduct their work, and people who haven't. Here, autonomy is the moderator variable. As you can see in the picture, high training leads to better job performance compared to low training. So there already is a relationship between the independent and dependent variable. However, when autonomy is high, this effect is much stronger. Thus, people with a high autonomy benefit more from high training in terms of their job performance. This is moderation, as the strength of the relationship between training and job performance is influenced by the moderator variable, which in this case is autonomy. Finally, you have mediator variables. A mediator variable may show that there is no relationship between the independent and dependent variable, as it is all being mediated by the mediating variable. In other words, it explains the relationship between the dependent and the independent variable. A mediator variable can explain the relationship between the dependent and the independent variable fully or partially. In other words, when there is mediation, your independent variable does not fully predict the change in your dependent variable. Let me give you an example. Let's say you've performed a previous test in your company on personality and performance and did indeed find that someone's personality is related to someone's performance. However, you wonder if there isn't a mediating variable in place here. Thus, you also measure each person's engagement level and find that this is also significantly related to someone's performance. More so, when you take this into account, you find that personality no longer influences performance directly, but only engagement. Here, you have a model where personality is not directly related to performance, but personality is related to performance through engagement. People with certain personalities have different levels of engagement, which impacts their performance at work. That is what we call mediation. So to wrap up, the independent variable is changed and tested for its effect on the dependent variable. The independent variable is your input. Your dependent variable is your output, the variable which is being predicted by changes in the independent variable. Your control variable is the variable that you control for. They are relevant variables that you have knowledge of and you want to include them in your analysis to make sure that they do not affect the relationship between the independent and dependent variables. And then you have your mediator and moderator variable. Your moderator variable explains the strength of the relationship between the dependent and independent variable. Your mediator causes mediation and can fully or partially explain the relationship between the dependent and the independent variable. The easiest way to find relevant variables to take into account in your tests is to look at literature. A lot of research has already been done on key HR metrics, such as turnover and engagement. Safe bets when analyzing people data are variables such as age, sex, time on the job, IQ, and education level. So think ahead of time which variables you want to take into account when performing your statistical test, which will allow you to gather the appropriate data. That's it for Module 2. In the next module, I will talk over the first of the statistical tests, such as t-test, ANOVAs, and more. This is where everything you've learned will come together, so I can't wait to teach you more about this. See you there.